Chapter 4 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 4. A Rose in Misery. A very young girl was standing in the half-open door. The dormer window of the garret, through which the light fell, was precisely opposite the door, and illuminated the figure with a wan light. She was a frail, emaciated, slender creature. There was nothing but a chemise and a petticoat upon that chilled and shivering nakedness. Her girdle was a string, her head ribbon a string. Her pointed shoulders emerged from her chemise, a blonde and lymphatic pallor, earth-coloured collarbones, red hands, a half-open and degraded mouth, missing teeth, dull, bold, base eyes. She had the form of a young girl who has missed her youth, and the look of a corrupt old woman, 50 years mingled with 15, one of those beings which are both feeble and horrible, and which cause those to shudder whom they do not cause to weep. Marius had risen, and was staring in a sort of stupor at this being, who was almost like the forms of the shadows which traverse dreams. The most heart-breaking thing of all was, that this young girl had not come into the world to be homely. In her early childhood she must even have been pretty. The grace of her age was still struggling against the hideous premature decrepitude of debauchery and poverty. The remains of beauty were dying away in that face of 16, like the pale sunlight which is extinguished under hideous clouds at dawn on a winter's day. That face was not wholly unknown to Marius. He thought he remembered having seen it somewhere. "What do you wish, mademoiselle?" he asked. The young girl replied in her voice of a drunken convict, "Here is a letter for you, Monsieur Marius." She called Marius by his name. He could not doubt that he was the person whom she wanted. But who was this girl? How did she know his name? Without waiting for him to tell her to advance, she entered. She entered resolutely, staring, with a sort of assurance that made the heart bleed, at the whole room and the unmade bed. Her feet were bare. Large holes in her petticoat permitted glimpses of her long legs and her thin knees. She was shivering. She held a letter in her hand, which she presented to Marius. Marius, as he opened the letter, noticed that the enormous wafer which sealed it was still moist. The message could not have come from a distance. He read: "My amiable neighbour, young man, I have learned of your goodness to me, that you paid my rent 6 months ago. I bless you, young man. My eldest daughter will tell you that we have been without a morsel of bread for 2 days, 4 persons and my spouse ill. If I am not deceived in my opinion, I think I may hope that your generous heart will melt at this statement, and the desire will subjugate you to be propitious to me by deigning to lavish on me a slight favour. I am, with the distinguished consideration which is due to the benefactors of humanity, Jondrette. P.S. My eldest daughter will await your orders, dear Monsieur Marius." This letter, coming in the very midst of the mysterious adventure which had occupied Marius's thoughts ever since the preceding evening, was like a candle in a cellar. All was suddenly illuminated. This letter came from the same place as the other 4. There was the same writing, the same style, the same orthography, the same paper, the same odour of tobacco. There were 5 missives, 5 histories, 5 signatures, and a single signer: the Spanish captain Don Alvarez, the unhappy Mistress Balizard, the dramatic poet Genflot, the old comedian Fabantou, were all 4 named Jondrette, if, indeed, Jondrette himself were named Jondrette. Marius had lived in the house for a tolerably long time, and he had had, as we have said, but very rare occasion to see, to even catch a glimpse of, his extremely mean neighbours. His mind was elsewhere, and where the mind is, there the eyes are also. He had been obliged more than once to pass the Jondrettes in the corridor, or on the stairs, but they were mere forms to him. He paid so little heed to them that, on the preceding evening, he had jostled the Jondrette girls on the boulevard without recognizing them, for it had evidently been they, and it was with great difficulty that the one who had just entered his room had awakened in him, in spite of disgust and pity, a vague recollection of having met her elsewhere. Now he saw everything clearly. He understood that his neighbor Jondrette, in his distress, exercised the industry of speculating on the charity of benevolent persons, that he procured addresses, and that he wrote under feigned names to people whom he judged to be wealthy and compassionate, letters which his daughters delivered at their risk and peril, for this father had come to such a pass that he risked his daughters. He was playing a game with fate, and he used them as the stake. Marius understood that probably, judging from their flight on the evening before, from their breathless condition, from their terror, and from the words of slang which he had overheard, these unfortunate creatures were plying some inexplicably sad profession, and that the result of the whole was, in the midst of human society, as it is now constituted, two miserable beings who were neither girls nor women, a species of impure and innocent monsters, produced by misery. Sad creatures, without name or sex or age, to whom neither good nor evil were any longer possible, and who, on emerging from childhood, have already nothing in this world, neither liberty, nor virtue, nor responsibility. Souls which blossomed out yesterday, and are faded today, like those flowers let fall in the streets which are soiled with every sort of mire, while waiting for some wheel to crush them. Nevertheless, while Marius bent a pained and astonished gaze on her, the young girl was wandering back and forth in the garret with the audacity of a spectre. She kicked about without troubling herself as to her nakedness. Occasionally her chemise, which was untied and torn, fell almost to her waist. She moved the chairs about, she disarranged the toilet articles which stood on the commode, she handled Marius's clothes, she rummaged about to see what was there in the corners. "Hullo," said she, "you have a mirror." And she hummed scraps of vaudevilles, as though she had been alone, frolicsome refrains which her hoarse and guttural voice rendered lugubrious. An indescribable constraint, weariness, and humiliation were perceptible beneath this hardihood. Effrontery is a disgrace. Nothing could be more melancholy than to see her sport about the room, and, so to speak, flit with the movements of a bird which is frightened by the daylight, or which has broken its wing. One felt that under other conditions of education and destiny, the gay and over-free mien of this young girl might have turned out sweet and charming. Never, even among animals, does the creature born to be a dove change into an osprey. That is only to be seen among men. Marius reflected and allowed her to have her way. She approached the table. "Ah," said she, "books." A flash pierced her glassy eye. She resumed, and her accent expressed the happiness which she felt in boasting of something to which no human creature is insensible. "I know how to read. I do." She eagerly seized a book which lay open on the table, and read with tolerable fluency. General Bauduin received orders to take the château of Hougomont, which stands in the middle of the plain of Waterloo, with 5 battalions of his brigade. She paused. "Ah, Waterloo! I know about that. It was a battle long ago. My father was there. My father has served in the armies. We are fine Bonapartists in our house, that we are. Waterloo was against the English." She laid down the book, caught up a pen, and exclaimed, "And I know how to write, too." She dipped her pen in the ink, and turning to Marius, "Do you want to see? Look here, I'm going to write a word to show you." And before he had time to answer, she wrote on a sheet of white paper, which lay in the middle of the table, "The bobbies are here." Then, throwing down the pen, "There are no faults of orthography. You can look. We have received an education, my sister and I. We have not always been as we are now. We were not made—" Here she paused, fixed her dull eyes on Marius, and burst out laughing, saying, with an intonation which contained every form of anguish, stifled by every form of cynicism, "Bah!" And she began to hum these words to a gay air: "Je faim, mon père. I am hungry, father. Pas de fricot. I have no food. J'ai froid, ma mère. I am cold, mother. Pas de tricot. I have no clothes. Grelotte, lolotte. Shiver, lolotte. Sanglotte, jacotte. Sob, jacotte. She had hardly finished this couplet when she exclaimed, "Do you ever go to the play, Monsieur Marius? I do. I have a little brother who is a friend of the artists, and who gives me tickets sometimes. But I don't like the benches in the galleries, one is cramped and uncomfortable there. There are rough people there sometimes, and people who smell bad." Then she scrutinized Marius, assumed a singular air, and said, "Do you know, Monsieur Marius, that you are a very handsome fellow?" And at the same moment, the same idea occurred to them both, and made her smile and him blush. She stepped up to him and laid her hand on his shoulder. "You pay no heed to me, but I know you, Monsieur Marius. I meet you here on the staircase, and then I often see you going to a person named Father Mabeuf, who lives in the direction of Austerlitz, sometimes when I have been strolling in that quarter. It is very becoming to you to have your hair tumbled thus." She tried to render her voice soft, but only succeeded in making it very deep. A portion of her words was lost in the transit from her larynx to her lips, as though on a piano where some notes are missing. Marius had retreated gently. "Mademoiselle," said he, with his cool gravity, "I have here a package which belongs to you, I think. Permit me to return it to you." And he held out the envelope containing the 4 letters. She clapped her hands and exclaimed, "We have been looking everywhere for that." Then she eagerly seized the package and opened the envelope, saying as she did so, "Dieu de Dieu, how my sister and I have hunted! And it was you who found it! On the boulevard, was it not? It must have been on the boulevard. You see, we let it fall when we were running. It was that brat of a sister of mine who was so stupid. When we got home we could not find it anywhere. As we did not wish to be beaten, as that is useless, as that is entirely useless, as it is absolutely useless, we said that we had carried the letters to the proper persons, and that they had said to us, 'Nix.' So here they are, those poor letters. And how did you find out that they belonged to me? Ah, yes, the writing. So it was you that we jostled as we passed last night. We couldn't see. I said to my sister, 'Is it a gentleman?' My sister said to me, 'I think it is a gentleman.'" In the meanwhile, she had unfolded the petition addressed to "the benevolent gentleman of the church of Saint Jacques du Haut Pas." "There," said she, "this is for that old fellow who goes to mass. By the way, this is his hour. I'll go and carry it to him. Perhaps he will give us something to breakfast on." Then she began to laugh again, and added, "Do you know what it will mean if we get breakfast to-day? It will mean that we shall have had our breakfast of the day before yesterday, our breakfast of yesterday, our dinner of to-day, and all that at once, and this morning. Come, parbleu! If you are not satisfied, dogs, burst." This reminded Marius of the wretched girl's errand to himself. He fumbled in his waistcoat pocket and found nothing there. The young girl went on, and seemed to have no consciousness of Marius' presence. "I often go off in the evening. Sometimes I don't come home again. Last winter, before we came here, we lived under the arches of the bridges. We huddled together to keep from freezing. My little sister cried. How melancholy the water is! When I thought of drowning myself, I said to myself, 'No, it's too cold.' I go out alone, whenever I choose. I sometimes sleep in the ditches. Do you know, at night, when I walk along the boulevard, I see the trees like forks. I see houses, all black and as big as Notre Dame. I fancy that the white walls of the river, I say to myself, 'Why, there's water there!' The stars are like the lamps and illuminations. One would say that they smoked and that the wind blew them out. I am bewildered as though horses were breathing in my ears. Although it is night, I hear hand organs and spinning machines, and I don't know what all. I think people are flinging stones at me. I flee without knowing whither. Everything whirls and whirls. You feel very queer when you have had no food." And then she stared at him with a bewildered air. By dint of searching and ransacking his pockets, Marius had finally collected 5 francs and 16 sous. This was all he owned in the world for the moment. At all events, he thought, there is my dinner for to-day, and to-morrow we will see. He kept the 16 sous, and handed the 5 francs to the young girl. She seized the coin. "Good," said she, "the sun is shining." And, as though the sun had possessed the property of melting the avalanches of slang in her brain, she went on, 5 francs, the shiner! A monarch! In this hole!
Ain't this fine? You're a jolly thief, I'm your humble servant. Bravo for the good fellows! 2 days' wine, and meat, and stew. We'll have a royal feast, and a good fill." She pulled her chemise up on her shoulders, made a low bow to Marius, then a familiar sign with her hand, and went towards the door, saying, "Good morning, sir. It's all right. I'll go and find my old man." As she passed, she caught sight of a dry crust of bread on the commode, which was mouldering there amid the dust. She flung herself upon it and bit into it, muttering, "That's good. It's hard. It breaks my teeth." Then she departed. End of Book 8, Chapter 4. Chapters 5 and 6 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 5, A Providential Peephole. Marius had lived for 5 years in poverty, in destitution, even in distress, but now he perceived that he had not known real misery. True misery he had but just had a view of. It was its spectre which had just passed before his eyes. In fact, he who has only beheld the misery of man has seen nothing. The misery of woman is what he must see. He who has seen only the misery of woman has seen nothing. He must see the misery of the child. When a man has reached his last extremity, he has reached his last resources at the same time. Woe to the defenceless beings who surround him. Work, wages, bread, fire, courage, goodwill, all fail him simultaneously. The light of day seems extinguished without, the moral light within. In these shadows, man encounters the feebleness of the woman and the child, and bends them violently to ignominy. Then all horrors become possible. Despair is surrounded with fragile partitions which all open on either vice or crime. Health, youth, honour, all the shy delicacies of the young body, the heart, virginity, modesty, that epidermis of the soul, are manipulated in sinister wise by that fumbling which seeks resources, which encounters opprobrium, and which accommodates itself to it. Fathers, mothers, children, brothers, sisters, men, women, daughters, adhere and become incorporated, almost like a mineral formation, in that dusky promiscuousness of sexes, relationships, ages, infamies, and innocences. They crouch back to back in a sort of hut of fate. They exchange woe-begone glances. Oh, the unfortunate wretches! How pale they are! How cold they are! It seems as though they dwelt on a planet much further from the sun than ours. This young girl was to Marius a sort of messenger from the realm of sad shadows. She revealed to him a hideous side of the night. Marius almost reproached himself for the preoccupations of reverie and passion which had prevented his bestowing a glance on his neighbours up to that day. The payment of their rent had been a mechanical movement, which anyone would have yielded to. But he, Marius, should have done better than that. What! Only a wall separated him from these abandoned beings, who lived gropingly in the dark, outside the pale of the rest of the world. He was elbow to elbow with them. He was, in some sort, the last link of the human race which they touched. He heard them live, or rather rattle in the death agony beside him, and he paid no heed to them. Every day, every instant, he heard them walking on the other side of the wall. He heard them go, and come, and speak, and he did not even lend an ear. And groans lay in those words, and he did not even listen to them. His thoughts were elsewhere, given up to dreams, to impossible radiances, to loves in the air, to follies. And all the while, human creatures, his brothers in Jesus Christ, his brothers in the people, were agonizing in vain beside him. He even formed a part of their misfortune, and he aggravated it, for if they had had another neighbour who was less chimerical and more attentive, any ordinary and charitable man, evidently their indigence would have been noticed, their signals of distress would have been perceived, and they would have been taken hold of and rescued. They appeared very corrupt and very depraved, no doubt, very vile, very odious even. But those who fall without becoming degraded are rare. Besides, there is a point where the unfortunate and the infamous unite and are confounded in a single word, a fatal word, the miserable. Whose fault is this? And then should not the charity be all the more profound, in proportion as the fall is great? While reading himself this moral lesson, for there were occasions on which Marius, like all truly honest hearts, was his own pedagogue and scolded himself more than he deserved, he stared at the wall which separated him from the Jondrettes, as though he were able to make his gaze, full of pity, penetrate that partition and warm these wretched people. The wall was a thin layer of plaster, upheld by laths and beams, and, as the reader had just learned, it allowed the sound of voices and words to be clearly distinguished. Only a man as dreamy as Marius could have failed to perceive this long before. There was no paper pasted on the wall, either on the side of the Jondrettes or on that of Marius. The coarse construction was visible in its nakedness. Marius examined the partition, almost unconsciously. Sometimes reverie examines, observes, and scrutinizes as thought would. All at once he sprang up. He had just perceived, near the top, close to the ceiling, a triangular hole which resulted from the space between three laths. The plaster which should have filled this cavity was missing, and, by mounting on the commode, a view could be had through this aperture into the Jondrettes' attic. Commiseration has, and should have, its curiosity. This aperture formed a sort of peep-hole. It is permissible to gaze at misfortune like a traitor in order to succour it. Let us get some little idea of what these people are like, thought Marius, and in what condition they are. He climbed upon the commode, put his eye to the crevice, and looked. Chapter 6. The Wild Man in His Lair. Cities, like forests, have their caverns in which all the most wicked and formidable creatures which they contain conceal themselves. Only in cities, that which thus conceals itself is ferocious, unclean, and petty, that is to say, ugly. In forests, that which conceals itself is ferocious, savage, and grand, that is to say, beautiful. Taking one lair with another, the beast's is preferable to the man's. Caverns are better than hovels. What Marius now beheld was a hovel. Marius was poor, and his chamber was poverty-stricken, but as his poverty was noble, his garret was neat. The den upon which his eye now rested was abject, dirty, fetid, pestiferous, mean, sordid. The only furniture consisted of a straw chair, an infirm table, some old bits of crockery, and in two of the corners, two indescribable pallets. All the light was furnished by a dormer window of 4 panes, draped with spiders' webs. Through this aperture, there penetrated just enough light to make the face of a man appear like the face of a phantom. The walls had a leprous aspect, and were covered with seams and scars, like a visage disfigured by some horrible malady. A repulsive moisture exuded from them. Obscene sketches roughly sketched with charcoal could be distinguished upon them. The chamber which Marius occupied had a dilapidated brick pavement. This one was neither tiled nor planked. Its inhabitants stepped directly on the antique plaster of the hovel, which had grown black under the long-continued pressure of feet. Upon this uneven floor, where the dirt seemed to be fairly encrusted, and which possessed but one virginity, that of the broom, were capriciously grouped constellations of old shoes, socks, and repulsive rags. However, this room had a fireplace, so it was let for 40 francs a year. There was every sort of thing in that fireplace, a brazier, a pot, broken boards, rags suspended from nails, a bird-cage, ashes, and even a little fire. 2 brands were smouldering there in a melancholy way. One thing which added still more to the horrors of this garret was, that it was large. It had projections and angles and black holes, the lower sides of roofs, bays, and promontories. Hence horrible, unfathomable nooks, where it seemed as though spiders as big as one's fist, woodlice as large as one's foot, and perhaps even, who knows, some monstrous human beings must be hiding.
One of the pallets was near the door, the other near the window. One end of each touched the fireplace and faced Marius. In a corner near the aperture through which Marius was gazing, a coloured engraving in a black frame was suspended to a nail on the wall, and at its bottom, in large letters, was an inscription, "The Dream." This represented a sleeping woman and a child also asleep, the child on the woman's lap, an eagle in a cloud, with a crown in his beak, and the woman thrusting the crown away from the child's head, without awakening the latter. In the background, Napoleon in a glory, leaning on a very blue column with a yellow capital ornamented with this inscription, Marengo, Austerlitz, Iéna, Wogam, Elot. Beneath this frame, a sort of wooden panel, which was no longer than it was broad, stood on the ground and rested in a sloping attitude against the wall. It had the appearance of a picture with its face turned to the wall, of a frame probably showing a daub on the other side, of some pier glass detached from a wall and lying forgotten there while waiting to be rehung. Near the table, upon which Marius descried a pen, ink, and paper, sat a man about 60 years of age, small, thin, livid, haggard, with a cunning, cruel, and uneasy air, a hideous scoundrel. If Lavater had studied this visage, he would have found the vulture mingled with the attorney there, the bird of prey and the pettifogger rendering each other mutually hideous and complementing each other, the pettifogger making the bird of prey ignoble, the bird of prey making the pettifogger horrible. This man had a long grey beard. He was clad in a woman's chemise, which allowed his hairy breast and his bare arms, bristling with grey hair, to be seen. Beneath this chemise, muddy trousers and boots through which his toes projected were visible. He had a pipe in his mouth and was smoking. There was no bread in the hovel, but there was still tobacco. He was writing probably some more letters like those which Marius had read. On the corner of the table lay an ancient, dilapidated, reddish volume, and the size, which was the antique 12mo of reading rooms, betrayed a romance. On the cover sprawled the following title, printed in large capitals, God, the King, Honour and the Ladies, by Ducray du Minil, 1814. As the man wrote, he talked aloud, and Marius heard his words. The idea that there is no equality even when you are dead. Just look at Père Lachaise. The great, those who are rich, are up above, in the acacia alley, which is paved. They can reach it in a carriage. The little people, the poor, the unhappy, well, what of them? They are put down below, where the mud is up to your knees, in the damp places. They are put there so that they will decay the sooner. You cannot go to see them without sinking into the earth. He paused, smote the table with his fist, and added, as he ground his teeth, "Oh, I could eat the whole world." A big woman, who might be 40 years of age, or 100, was crouching near the fireplace on her bare heels. She too was clad only in a chemise and a knitted petticoat patched with bits of old cloth. A coarse linen apron concealed the half of her petticoat. Although this woman was doubled up and bent together, it could be seen that she was of very lofty stature. She was a sort of giant beside her husband. She had hideous hair of a reddish blonde which was turning grey, and which she thrust back from time to time, with her enormous shining hands, with their flat nails. Beside her, on the floor, wide open, lay a book of the same form as the other, and probably a volume of the same romance. On one of the pallets, Marius caught a glimpse of a sort of tall, pale young girl, who sat there half naked and with pendant feet, and who did not seem to be listening or seeing or living. No doubt the younger sister of the one who had come to his room. She seemed to be 11 or 12 years of age. On closer scrutiny, it was evident that she was really 14. She was the child who had said, on the boulevard the evening before, "I bolted, bolted, bolted." She was of that puny sort which remains backward for a long time, then suddenly starts up rapidly. It is indigence which produces these melancholy human plans. These creatures have neither childhood nor youth. At 15 years of age they appear to be 12, at 16 they seem 20. Today a little girl, tomorrow a woman. One might say that they stride through life in order to get through with it the more speedily. At this moment, this being had the air of a child. Moreover, no trace of work was revealed in that dwelling, no handicraft, no spinning wheel, not a tool. In one corner lay some ironmongery of dubious aspect. It was the dull listlessness which follows despair and precedes the death agony. Marius gazed for a while at this gloomy interior, more terrifying than the interior of a tomb, for the human soul could be felt fluttering there, and life was palpitating there. The garret, the cellar, the lowly ditch where certain indigent wretches crawl at the very bottom of the social edifice, is not exactly the sepulchre, but only its antechamber. But, as the wealthy display their greatest magnificence at the entrance of their palaces, it seems that death, which stands directly side by side with them, places its greatest miseries in that vestibule. The man held his peace, the woman spoke no word, the young girl did not even seem to breathe. The scratching of the pen on the paper was audible. The man grumbled without pausing in his writing. Canaille, canaille, everybody is canaille. This variation to Solomon's exclamation elicited a sigh from the woman. Calm yourself, my little friend, she said. Don't hurt yourself, my dear. You are too good to write to all those people, husband. Bodies press close to each other in misery, as in cold, but hearts draw apart. This woman must have loved this man, to all appearance, judging from the amount of love within her, but probably, in the daily and reciprocal reproaches of the horrible distress which weighed on the whole group, this had become extinct. There no longer existed in her anything more than the ashes of affection for her husband. Nevertheless, caressing appellations had survived, as is often the case. She called him my dear, my little friend, my good man, etc., with her mouth, while her heart was silent. The man resumed his writing. End of Book 8, Chapters 5 and 6.
Chapters 7 and 8 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 7, Strategy and Tactics. Marius, with a load upon his breast, was on the point of descending from the species of observatory which he had improvised, when a sound attracted his attention and caused him to remain at his post. The door of the attic had just burst open abruptly. The eldest girl made her appearance on the threshold. On her feet she had large, coarse men's shoes, bespattered with mud, which had splashed even to her red ankles, and she was wrapped in an old mantle which hung in tatters. Marius had not seen it on her an hour previously, but she had probably deposited it at his door in order that she might inspire the more pity, and had picked it up again on emerging. She entered, pushed the door to behind her, paused to take breath, for she was completely breathless, then exclaimed with an expression of triumph and joy, "He is coming!" The father turned his eyes towards her, the woman turned her head, the little sister did not stir. "Who?" demanded her father. "The gentleman." "The philanthropist?" "Yes." "From the church of Saint-Jacques?" "Yes." "That old fellow?" "Yes." "And he is coming?" "He is following me." "You are sure?" "I am sure." "There, truly, he is coming?" "He is coming in a fiacre." "In a fiacre? He is a Rothschild." The father rose. "How are you sure? If he is coming in a fiacre, how is it that you arrived before him? You gave him our address at least? Did you tell him that it was the last door at the end of the corridor on the right? If he only does not make a mistake. So you found him at the church? Did he read my letter? What did he say to you?" "Ta, ta, ta," said the girl. "How you do gallop on, my good man. See here, I entered the church, he was in his usual place, I made him a reverence, and I handed him the letter. He read it, and said to me, "Where do you live, my child?" I said, "Monsieur, I will show you." He said to me, "No, give me your address. My daughter has some purchases to make. I will take a carriage and reach your house at the same time that you do." I gave him the address. When I mentioned the house, he seemed surprised, and hesitated for an instant. Then he said, "Never mind, I will come." When the mass was finished, I watched him leave the church with his daughter, and I saw them enter a carriage. I certainly did tell him the last door in the corridor on the right. "And what makes you think that he will come?" "I have just seen the fiacre turn into the Rue Petit Banquier. That is what made me run so." "How do you know it was the same fiacre?" "Because I took notice of the number, so there." "What was the number?" 440. "Good. You are a clever girl." The girl stared boldly at her father, and showing the shoes which she had on her feet. "A clever girl, possibly, but I tell you I won't put these shoes on again, and that I won't, for the sake of my health in the first place, and for the sake of cleanliness in the next. I don't know anything more irritating than shoes that squelch and go kee, kee, kee the whole time. I prefer to go barefoot." "You are right," said her father in a sweet tone which contrasted with the young girl's rudeness. "But then you will not be allowed to enter churches, for poor people must have shoes to do that. One cannot go barefoot to the good God," he added bitterly. Then, returning to the subject which absorbed him, "So you are sure that he will come?" "He is following on my heels," said she. The man started up. A sort of illumination appeared on his countenance. "Wife," he exclaimed, "you hear? Here is the philanthropist. Extinguish the fire." The stupefied mother did not stir. The father, with the agility of an acrobat, seized a broken-nosed jug which stood on the chimney, and flung the water on the brands. Then, addressing his eldest daughter, "Here, you, pull the straw off that chair." His daughter did not understand. He seized the chair, and with one kick he rendered it seatless. His leg passed through it. As he withdrew his leg, he asked his daughter, "Is it cold?" "Very cold. It is snowing." The father turned towards the younger girl who sat on the bed near the window, and shouted to her in a thundering voice, "Quick! Get off that bed, you lazy thing! Will you never do anything? Break a pane of glass!" The little girl jumped off the bed with a shiver. "Break a pane!" he repeated. The child stood still in bewilderment. "Do you hear me?" repeated her father. "I tell you to break a pane." The child, with a sort of terrified obedience, rose on tiptoe and struck a pane with her fist. The glass broke and fell with a loud clatter. "Good," said the father. He was grave and abrupt. His glance swept rapidly over all the crannies of the garret. One would have said that he was a general making the final preparation at the moment when the battle is on the point of beginning. The mother, who had not said a word so far, now rose and demanded in a dull, slow, languid voice, whence her words seemed to emerge in a congealed state, "What do you mean to do, my dear?" "Get into bed," replied the man. His intonation admitted of no deliberation. The mother obeyed and threw herself heavily on one of the pallets. In the meantime, a sob became audible in one corner. "What's that?" cried the father. The younger daughter exhibited her bleeding fist, without quitting the corner in which she was cowering. She had wounded herself while breaking the window. She went off near her mother's pallet and wept silently. It was now the mother's turn to start up and exclaim, "Just see there, what follies you commit! She has cut herself breaking that pane for you." "So much the better," said the man. "I foresaw that." "What? So much the better?" retorted his wife. "Peace," replied the father. "I suppress the liberty of the press." Then, tearing the woman's chemise which he was wearing, he made a strip of cloth with which he hastily swathed the little girl's bleeding wrist. That done, his eye fell with a satisfied expression on his torn chemise. "And the chemise too," said he. "This has a good appearance." An icy breeze whistled through the window and entered the room. The outer mist penetrated thither, and diffused itself like a whitish sheet of wadding vaguely spread by invisible fingers. Through the broken pane the snow could be seen falling. The snow promised by the Candlemas sun of the preceding day had actually come. The father cast a glance about him as though to make sure that he had forgotten nothing. He seized an old shovel and spread ashes over the wet brands in such a manner as to entirely conceal them. Then, drawing himself up and leaning against the chimney-piece, "Now," said he, "we can receive the philanthropist." Chapter 8. The Ray of Light in the Hovel. The big girl approached and laid her hand in her father's. "Feel how cold I am," said she. "Bah!" replied the father, "I am much colder than that." The mother exclaimed impetuously, "You always have something better than anyone else, so you do, even bad things." "Down with you," said the man. The mother, being eyed after a certain fashion, held her tongue. Silence reigned for a moment in the hovel. The elder girl was removing the mud from the bottom of her mantle with a careless air. Her younger sister continued to sob. The mother had taken the latter's head between her hands, and was covering it with kisses, whispering to her the while, "My treasure, I entreat you, it is nothing of consequence. Don't cry. You will anger your father." "No," exclaimed the father, "quite the contrary. Sob, sob, that's right." Then turning to the elder, "There now, he's not coming. What if he were not to come? I shall have extinguished my fire, wrecked my chair, torn my shirt, and broken my pane, all for nothing." "And wounded the child," murmured the mother. "Do you know," went on the father, "that it's beastly cold in this devil's garret? What if that man should not come? Oh, see there, you! He makes us wait. He says to himself, 'Well, they will wait for me. That's what they're there for.' Oh, how I hate them, and with what joy, jubilation, enthusiasm, and satisfaction I could strangle all those rich folks, all those rich folks. These men who pretend to be charitable, who put on airs, who go to mass, who make presents to the priesthood, preachy, preachy, in their skull caps, and who think themselves above us, and who come for the purpose of humiliating us, and to bring us clothes, as they say, old duds that are not worth 4 sous, and bread. That's not what I want, pack of rascals that they are. It's money. Ah, money. Never, because they say that we would go off and drink it up, and that we are drunkards and idlers. And they? What are they then? And what have they been in their time? Thieves. They never could have become rich otherwise. Oh, society ought to be grasped by the 4 corners of the cloth and tossed into the air, all of it. It would all be smashed very likely, but at least no one would have anything, and there would be that much gained. But what is that blockhead of a benevolent gentleman doing? Will he come? Perhaps the animal has forgotten the address. I bet that old beast—" At that moment there came a light tap at the door. The man rushed to it and opened it, exclaiming amid profound bows and smiles of adoration, "Enter, sir, deign to enter, most respected benefactor, and your charming young lady also." A man of ripe age and a young girl made their appearance on the threshold of the attic. Marius had not quitted his post. His feelings for the moment surpassed the powers of the human tongue. It was she. Whoever has loved knows all the radiant meanings contained in those 3 letters of that word. She. It was certainly she. Marius could hardly distinguish her through the luminous vapour which had suddenly spread before his eyes. It was that sweet, absent being, that star which had beamed upon him for 6 months. It was those eyes, that brow, that mouth, that lovely vanished face which had created night by its departure. The vision had been eclipsed, now it reappeared. It reappeared in that gloom, in that garret, in that misshapen attic, in all that horror. Marius shuddered in dismay. What? It was she! The palpitations of his heart troubled his sight. He felt that he was on the brink of bursting into tears. What? He beheld her again at last, after having sought her for so long. It seemed to him that he had lost his soul, and that he had just found it again. She was the same as ever, only a little pale. Her delicate face was framed in a bonnet of violet velvet. Her figure was concealed beneath a pelisse of black satin. Beneath her long dress a glimpse could be caught of her tiny foot, shod in a silken boot. She was still accompanied by Monsieur Leblanc. She had taken a few steps into the room, and had deposited a tolerably bulky parcel on the table. The eldest Jondrette girl had retired behind the door, and was staring, with sombre eyes, at that velvet bonnet, that silk mantle, and that charming, happy face. End of Book 8, Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 9 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 9. Jondrette comes near weeping. The hovel was so dark that people coming from without felt on entering it the effect produced on entering a cellar. The two newcomers advanced, therefore, with a certain hesitation, being hardly able to distinguish the vague forms surrounding them, while they could be clearly seen and scrutinized by the eyes of the inhabitants of the garret, who were accustomed to this twilight. Monsieur Leblanc approached with his sad but kindly look, and said to Jondrette the father, "Monsieur, in this package you will find some new clothes, and some woolen stockings and blankets." "Our angelic benefactor overwhelms us," said Jondrette, bowing to the very earth. Then, bending down to the ear of his eldest daughter while the two visitors were engaged in examining this lamentable interior, he added, in a low and rapid voice, "Hey, what did I say? Duds. No money. They're all alike. By the way, how was the letter to that old blockhead signed?" "Fabantou," replied the girl. "The dramatic artist. Good." It was lucky for Jondrette that this had occurred to him, for at the very moment Monsieur Leblanc turned to him and said to him with the air of a person who is seeking to recall a name, "I see that you are greatly to be pitied, Monsieur—" "Fabantou," replied Jondrette quickly. "Monsieur Fabantou, yes, that is it, I remember. Dramatic artist, sir, and one who has had some success." Here Jondrette evidently judged the moment propitious for capturing the philanthropist. He exclaimed with an accent which smacked at the same time of the vainglory of the mountebank at fairs and the humility of the mendicant on the highway, "A pupil of Talma, sir, I am a pupil of Talma. Fortune formerly smiled on me. Alas, now it is misfortune's turn. You see, my benefactor, no bread, no fire. My poor babes have no fire. My only chair has no seat, a broken pane, and in such weather. My spouse in bed, ill." "Poor woman," said Monsieur Leblanc. "My child wounded," added Jondrette. The child, diverted by the arrival of the strangers, had fallen to contemplating the young lady, and had ceased to sob. "Cry, bawl," said Jondrette to her in a low voice. At the same time he pinched her sore hand. All this was done with the talent of a juggler. The little girl gave vent to loud shrieks. The adorable young girl, whom Marius in his heart called his Ursule, approached her hastily. "Poor dear child," said she. "You see, my beautiful young lady," pursued Jondrette, "her bleeding wrist. It came through an accident while working at a machine to earn 6 sous a day. It may be necessary to cut off her arm." "Really?" said the old gentleman, in alarm. The little girl, taking this seriously, fell to sobbing more violently than ever. "Alas, yes, my benefactor," replied the father. For several minutes Jondrette had been scrutinizing the benefactor in a singular fashion. As he spoke, he seemed to be examining the other attentively, as though seeking to summon up his recollections. All at once, profiting by a moment when the newcomers were questioning the child with interest as to her injured hand, he passed near his wife, who lay in her bed with a stupid and dejected air, and said to her in a rapid but very low tone, "Take a look at that man." Then, turning to Monsieur Leblanc and continuing his lamentations, "You see, sir, all the clothing that I have is my wife's chemise, and all torn at that. In the depths of winter, I can't go out for lack of a coat. If I had a coat of any sort, I would go and see Mademoiselle Mars, who knows me and is very fond of me. Does she not still reside in the Rue de la Tour des Dames? Do you know, sir? We played together in the provinces. I shared her laurels. Célimène would come to my succor, sir. Elmire would bestow alms on Bélisaire. But no, nothing, and not a sou in the house. My wife ill, and not a sou. My daughter dangerously injured, not a sou. My wife suffers from fits of suffocation. It comes from her age. Besides, her nervous system is affected. She ought to have assistance, and my daughter also. But the doctor, but the apothecary, how am I to pay them? I would kneel to a penny, sir. Such is the condition to which the arts are reduced. And do you know, my charming young lady, and you, my generous protector, do you know, you who breathe forth virtue and goodness, and who perfume that church where my daughter sees you every day when she says her prayers, for I have brought up my children religiously, sir. I did not want them to take to the theatre. Ah, the hussies, if I catch them tripping! I do not jest, that I don't. I read them lessons on honour, on morality, on virtue. Ask them. They have got to walk straight. They are none of your unhappy wretches who begin by having no family and end by espousing the public. One is Mamselle Nobody, and one becomes Madame Everybody. Deuce take it. None of that in the Fabantou family. I mean to bring them up virtuously, and they shall be honest and nice and believe in God by the sacred name. Well, sir, my worthy sir, do you know what is going to happen tomorrow? Tomorrow is the 4th day of February, the fatal day, the last day of grace allowed me by my landlord. If by this evening I have not paid my rent, tomorrow my oldest daughter, my spouse with her fever, my child with her wound, we shall all 4 be turned out of here and thrown into the street, on the boulevard, without shelter, in the rain, in the snow. There, sir, I owe for 4 quarters a whole year. That is to say, 60 francs. Jondrette lied. 4 quarters would have amounted to only 40 francs, and he could not owe 4 because 6 months had not elapsed since Marius had paid for 2. Monsieur Leblanc drew 5 francs from his pocket and threw them on the table. Jondrette found time to mutter in the ear of his eldest daughter, "The scoundrel! What does he think I can do with his 5 francs? That won't pay me for my chair and pane of glass. That's what comes of incurring expenses." In the meanwhile, Monsieur Leblanc had removed the large brown greatcoat which he wore over his blue coat, and had thrown it over the back of the chair. "Monsieur Fabantou," he said, "these 5 francs are all that I have about me, but I shall now take my daughter home, and I will return this evening. It is this evening that you must pay, is it not?" Jondrette's face lighted up with a strange expression. He replied vivaciously, "Yes, respected sir, at 8 o'clock I must be at my landlord's." "I will be here at 6, and I will fetch you the 60 francs." "My benefactor!" exclaimed Jondrette, overwhelmed, and he added in a low voice, "Take a good look at him, wife." Monsieur Leblanc had taken the arm of the young girl once more, and had turned towards the door. "Farewell until this evening, my friends," said he. 6 o'clock, said Jondrette. 6 o'clock precisely. At that moment the overcoat lying on the chair caught the eye of the elder Jondrette girl. "You are forgetting your coat, sir," said she. Jondrette darted an annihilating look at his daughter, accompanied by a formidable shrug of the shoulders. Monsieur Leblanc turned back and said with a smile, "I have not forgotten it. I am leaving it." "Oh, my protector," said Jondrette, "my august benefactor, I melt into tears. Permit me to accompany you to your carriage." "If you come out," answered Monsieur Leblanc, "put on this coat. It really is very cold." Jondrette did not need to be told twice. He hastily donned the brown greatcoat, and all 3 went out, Jondrette preceding the 2 strangers. End of Book 8, Chapter 9.
Chapters 10 and 11 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 10. Tariff of licensed cabs, 2 francs an hour. Marius had lost nothing of this scene, and yet in reality he had seen nothing. His eyes had remained fixed on the young girl. His heart had, so to speak, seized her and wholly enveloped her from the moment of her very first step in that garret. During her entire stay there, he had lived that life of ecstasy which suspends material perceptions and precipitates the whole soul on a single point. He had contemplated, not that girl, but that light which wore a satin pelisse and a velvet bonnet. The star Sirius might have entered the room, and he would not have been any more dazzled. While the young girl was engaged in opening the package, unfolding the clothing and the blankets, questioning the sick mother kindly, and the little injured girl tenderly, he watched her every movement, he sought to catch her words. He knew her eyes, her brow, her beauty, her form, her walk. He did not know the sound of her voice. He had once fancied that he had caught a few words at the Luxembourg, but he was not absolutely sure of the fact. He would have given 10 years of his life to hear it, in order that he might bear away in his soul a little of that music. But everything was drowned in the lamentable exclamations and trumpet bursts of Jondrette. This added a touch of genuine wrath to Marius's ecstasy. He devoured her with his eyes. He could not believe that it really was that divine creature whom he saw in the midst of those vile creatures in that monstrous lair. It seemed to him that he beheld a hummingbird in the midst of toads. When she took her departure, he had but one thought: to follow her, to cling to her trace, not to quit her until he learned where she lived, not to lose her again at least, after having so miraculously rediscovered her. He leapt down from the commode and seized his hat. As he laid his hand on the lock of the door, and was on the point of opening it, a sudden reflection caused him to pause. The corridor was long, the staircase steep. Jondrette was talkative. Monsieur Leblanc had no doubt not yet regained his carriage. If, on turning round in the corridor or on the staircase, he were to catch sight of him, Marius, in that house, he would evidently take the alarm, and find means to escape from him again, and this time it would be final. What was he to do? Should he wait a little? But while he was waiting, the carriage might drive off. Marius was perplexed. At last he accepted the risk, and quitted his room. There was no one in the corridor. He hastened to the stairs. There was no one on the staircase. He descended in all haste, and reached the boulevard in time to see a fiacre turning the corner of the Rue de Petit Banquier on his way back to Paris. Marius rushed headlong in that direction. On arriving at the angle of the boulevard, he caught sight of the fiacre again, rapidly descending the Rue Mouffetard. The carriage was already a long way off, and there was no means of overtaking it. What? Run after it? Impossible. And besides, the people in the carriage would assuredly notice an individual running at full speed in pursuit of a fiacre, and the father would recognize him. At that moment, wonderful and unprecedented good luck, Marius perceived an empty cab passing along the boulevard. There was but one thing to be done: to jump into this cab and follow the fiacre. That was sure, efficacious, and free from danger. Marius made the driver a sign to halt, and called to him, "By the hour?" Marius wore no cravat. He had on his working coat, which was destitute of buttons, and his shirt was torn along one of the plaits on the bosom. The driver halted, winked, and held out his left hand to Marius, rubbing his forefinger gently with his thumb. "What is it?" said Marius. "Pay in advance," said the coachman. Marius recollected that he had but 16 sous about him. "How much?" he demanded. 40 sous. "I will pay on my return." The driver's only reply was to whistle the air of La Police and to whip up his horse. Marius stared at the retreating cabriolet with a bewildered air. For the lack of 24 sous, he was losing his joy, his happiness, his love. He had seen, and he was becoming blind again. He reflected bitterly, and it must be confessed with profound regret, on the 5 francs which he had bestowed that very morning on that miserable girl. If he had had those 5 francs, he would have been saved. He would have been born again. He would have emerged from the limbo and darkness. He would have made his escape from isolation and spleen, from his widowed state. He might have reknotted the black thread of his destiny to that beautiful golden thread, which had just floated before his eyes and had broken at the same instant once more. He returned to his hovel in despair. He might have told himself that Monsieur Leblanc had promised to return in the evening, and that all he had to do was to set about the matter more skilfully, so that he might follow him on that occasion. But in his contemplation it is doubtful whether he had heard this. As he was on the point of mounting the staircase, he perceived on the other side of the boulevard, near the deserted wall skirting the Rue de la Barrière de Gobelin, Jondrette, wrapped in the philanthropist's greatcoat, engaged in conversation with one of those men of disquieting aspect who have been dubbed by common consent prowlers of the barriers. People of equivocal face, of suspicious monologues, who present the air of having evil minds, and who generally sleep in the daytime, which suggests the supposition that they work by night. These 2 men, standing there motionless and in conversation, in the snow which was falling in whirlwinds, formed a group that a policeman would surely have observed, but which Marius hardly noticed. Still, in spite of his mournful preoccupation, he could not refrain from saying to himself that this prowler of the barriers with whom Jondrette was talking resembled a certain Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenaille, whom Courfeyrac had once pointed out to him as a very dangerous nocturnal roamer. This man's name the reader has learned in the preceding book. This Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenaille, figured later on in many criminal trials, and became a notorious rascal. He was at that time only a famous rascal. Today he exists in the state of tradition among ruffians and assassins. He was at the head of a school towards the end of the last reign. And in the evening, at nightfall, at the hour when groups form and talk in whispers, he was discussed at La Force in the Fosse aux Lions. One might even, in that prison, precisely at the spot where the sewer which served the unprecedented escape in broad daylight of 30 prisoners in 1843 passes under the culvert, read his name, Panchaud, audaciously carved by his own hand on the wall of the sewer during one of his attempts at flight. In 1832 the police already had their eye on him, but he had not as yet made a serious beginning. Chapter 11. Offers of Service, from Misery to Wretchedness. Marius ascended the stairs of the hovel with slow steps. At the moment when he was about to re-enter his cell, he caught sight of the elder Jondrette girl following him through the corridor. The very sight of this girl was odious to him. It was she who had his 5 francs. It was too late to demand them back. The cab was no longer there, the fiacre was far away. Moreover, she would not have given them back. As for questioning her about the residence of the persons who had just been there, that was useless. It was evident that she did not know, since the letter signed Fabantou had been addressed to the benevolent gentleman of the church of Saint-Jacques-du-Haut-Pas. Marius entered his room and pushed the door to after him. It did not close. He turned round and beheld a hand which held the door half open. "What is it?" he asked. "Who is there?" It was the Jondrette girl. "Is it you?" resumed Marius almost harshly. "Still you! What do you want with me?" She appeared to be thoughtful, and did not look at him. She no longer had the air of assurance which had characterized her that morning. She did not enter, but held back in the darkness of the corridor, where Marius could see her through the half-open door. "Come now, will you answer?" cried Marius. "What do you want with me?" She raised her dull eyes, in which a sort of gleam seemed to flicker vaguely, and said, "Monsieur Marius, you look sad. What is the matter with you?" "With me?" said Marius. "Yes, you." "There is nothing the matter with me." "Yes, there is." "No." "I tell you there is." "Let me alone." Marius gave the door another push, but she retained her hold on it. "Stop," said she. "You are in the wrong. Although you are not rich, you were kind this morning. Be so again now. You gave me something to eat. Now tell me what ails you. You are grieved, that is plain. I do not want you to be grieved. What can be done for it? Can I be of any service? Employ me. I do not ask for your secrets. You need not tell them to me, but I may be of use nevertheless. I may be able to help you, since I help my father. When it is necessary to carry letters, to go to houses, to inquire from door to door, to find out an address, to follow anyone, I am of service. Well, you may assuredly tell me what is the matter with you, and I will go and speak to the persons. Sometimes it is enough if someone speaks to the persons. That suffices to let them understand matters, and everything comes right. Make use of me." An idea flashed across Marius's mind. What branch does one disdain when one feels that one is falling? He drew near to the Jondrette girl. "Listen," he said to her. She interrupted him with a gleam of joy in her eyes. "Oh, yes, do call me thou. I like that better." "Well," he resumed, "thou hast brought hither that old gentleman and his daughter." "Yes." "Dost thou know their address?" "No." "Find it for me." The Jondrette's dull eyes had grown joyous, and they now became gloomy. "Is that what you want?" she demanded. "Yes." "Do you know them?" "No." "That is to say," she resumed quickly, "you do not know her, but you wish to know her." This them, which had turned into her, had something indescribably significant and bitter about it. "Well, can you do it?" said Marius. "You shall have the beautiful lady's address." There was still a shade in the words, "the beautiful lady," which troubled Marius. He resumed, "Never mind. After all, the address of the father and daughter. Their address, indeed." She gazed fixedly at him. "What will you give me?" "Anything you like." "Anything I like?" "Yes." "You shall have the address." She dropped her head. Then, with a brusque movement, she pulled to the door, which closed behind her. Marius found himself alone. He dropped into a chair, with his head and both elbows on his bed, absorbed in thoughts which he could not grasp, and as though a prey to vertigo. All that had taken place since the morning, the appearance of the angel, her disappearance, what that creature had just said to him, a gleam of hope floating in an immense despair, this was what filled his brain confusedly. All at once he was violently aroused from his reverie. He heard the shrill, hard voice of Jondrette utter these words, which were fraught with a strange interest for him. "I tell you I am sure of it, and that I recognized him." Of whom was Jondrette speaking? Whom had he recognized? Monsieur Leblanc? The father of his Ursule? What, did Jondrette know him? Was Marius about to obtain, in this abrupt and unexpected fashion, all the information without which his life was so dark to him? Was he about to learn at last who it was that he loved, who that young girl was, who her father was? Was the dense shadow which enwrapped them on the point of being dispelled? Was the veil about to be rent? Ah, heavens! He bounded rather than climbed upon his commode, and resumed his post near the little peephole in the partition wall. Again he beheld the interior of Jondrette's hovel. End of Book 8, Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 12. The Use Made of Monsieur Leblanc's 5-franc piece. Nothing in the aspect of the family was altered, except that the wife and daughters had levied on the package and put on woolen stockings and jackets. 2 new blankets were thrown across the 2 beds. Jondrette had evidently just returned. He still had the breathlessness of out-of-doors. His daughters were seated on the floor near the fireplace, the elder engaged in dressing the younger's wounded hand. His wife had sunk back on the bed near the fireplace, with a face indicative of astonishment. Jondrette was pacing up and down the garret with long strides. His eyes were extraordinary. The woman, who seemed timid and overwhelmed with stupor in the presence of her husband, turned to say, "What, really? You are sure?" "Sure. 8 years have passed, but I recognize him. Ah, I recognize him. I knew him at once. What, didn't it force itself on you?" "No." "But I told you, pay attention. Why, it is his figure, it is his face, only older. There are people who do not grow old. I don't know how they manage it. It is the very sound of his voice. He is better dressed, that's all. Ah, you mysterious old devil, I've got you, that I have." He paused and said to his daughters, "Get out of here, you. It's queer that it didn't strike you." They arose to obey. The mother stammered, "With her injured hand." "The air will do it good," said Jondrette. "Be off." It was plain that this man was of the sort to whom no one offers to reply. The 2 girls departed. At the moment when they were about to pass through the door, the father detained the elder by the arm and said to her with a peculiar accent, "You will be here at 5 o'clock precisely, both of you. I shall need you." Marius redoubled his attention. On being left alone with his wife, Jondrette began to pace the room again, and made the tour of it 2 or 3 times in silence. Then he spent several minutes in tucking the lower part of the woman's chemise which he wore into his trousers. All at once he turned to the female Jondrette, folded his arms, and exclaimed, "And would you like to have me tell you something? The young lady—" "Well, what?" retorted his wife. "The young lady?" Marius could not doubt that it was really she of whom they were speaking. He listened with ardent anxiety. His whole life was in his ears. But Jondrette had bent over and spoke to his wife in a whisper. Then he straightened himself up and concluded aloud, "It is she." "That one?" said his wife. "That very one," said the husband. No expression can reproduce the significance of the mother's words. Surprise, rage, hate, wrath were mingled and combined in one monstrous intonation. The pronunciation of a few words, the name, no doubt, which her husband had whispered in her ear, had sufficed to rouse this huge, somnolent woman, and from being repulsive, she became terrible. "It is not possible," she cried, "when I think that my daughters are going barefoot and have not a gown to their backs. What! A satin pelisse, a velvet bonnet, boots, and everything, more than 200 francs worth of clothes, so that one would think she was a lady. No, you are mistaken. Why, in the first place, the other was hideous, and this one is not so bad-looking. She really is not bad-looking. It can't be she. I tell you that it is she. You will see." At this absolute assertion, the Jondrette woman raised her large, red, blonde face and stared at the ceiling with a horrible expression. At that moment, she seemed to Marius even more to be feared than her husband. She was a sow with the look of a tigress. "What?" she resumed. "That horrible, beautiful young lady who gazed at my daughters with an air of pity, she is that beggar brat? Oh, I should like to kick her stomach in for her." She sprang off of the bed and remained standing for a moment, her hair in disorder, her nostrils dilating, her mouth half open, her fists clenched and drawn back. Then she fell back on the bed once more. The man paced to and fro and paid no attention to his female. After a silence lasting several minutes, he approached the female Jondrette and halted in front of her with folded arms as he had done a moment before. "And shall I tell you another thing?" "What is it?" she asked. He answered in a low, curt voice, "My fortune is made." The woman stared at him with the look that signifies, "Is the person who is addressing me on the point of going mad?" He went on, "Thunder! It was not so very long ago that I was a parishioner of the parish of 'Die of hunger if you have a fire, die of cold if you have bread.' I have had enough of misery, my share and other people's share. I am not joking any longer. I don't find it comic any more. I've had enough of puns. Good God, no more farces, Eternal Father. I want to eat till I am full. I want to drink my fill, to gormandize, to sleep, to do nothing. I want to have my turn, so I do. Come now, before I die. I want to be a bit of a millionaire." He took a turn round the hovel and added, "Like other people." "What do you mean by that?" asked the woman. He shook his head, winked, screwed up one eye, and raised his voice like a medical professor who is about to make a demonstration. "What do I mean by that? Listen." "Hush," muttered the woman, "not so loud. These are matters which must not be overheard." "Bah, who's here? Our neighbour? I saw him go out a little while ago. Besides, he doesn't listen, the big booby, and I tell you that I saw him go out." Nevertheless, by a sort of instinct, Jondrette lowered his voice, although not sufficiently to prevent Marius hearing his words. One favourable circumstance which enabled Marius not to lose a word of this conversation was the falling snow, which deadened the sound of vehicles on the boulevard. This is what Marius heard. "Listen carefully. The Croesus is caught, or as good as caught. That's all settled already. Everything is arranged. I have seen some people. He will come here this evening at 6 o'clock to bring 60 francs, the rascal. Did you notice how I played that game on him? My 60 francs, my landlord, my 4th of February. I don't even owe for 1 quarter. Isn't he a fool? So, he will come at 6 o'clock. That's the hour when our neighbour goes to his dinner. Mother Bougon is off washing dishes in the city. There's not a soul in the house. The neighbour never comes home until 11 o'clock. The children shall stand on watch. You shall help us. He will give in." "And what if he does not give in?" demanded his wife. Jondrette made a sinister gesture and said, "We'll fix him." And he burst out laughing. This was the first time Marius had seen him laugh. The laugh was cold and sweet, and provoked a shudder. Jondrette opened a cupboard near the fireplace and drew from it an old cap, which he placed on his head, after brushing it with his sleeve. "Now," said he, "I'm going out. I have some more people that I must see, good ones. You'll see how well the whole thing will work. I shall be away as short a time as possible. It's a fine stroke of business. Do you look after the house." And, with both fists thrust into the pockets of his trousers, he stood for a moment in thought, then exclaimed, "Do you know, it's mighty lucky, by the way, that he didn't recognize me. If he had recognized me on his side, he would not have come back again. He would have slipped through our fingers. It was my beard that saved us, my romantic beard, my pretty little romantic beard." And again he broke into a laugh. He stepped to the window. The snow was still falling, still streaking the grey of the sky. "What beastly weather," said he. Then, lapping his overcoat across his breast, "This rind is too large for me. Never mind," he added. "He did a devilish good thing in leaving it for me, the old scoundrel. If it hadn't been for that, I couldn't have gone out, and everything would have gone wrong. What small points things hang on, anyway." And pulling his cap down over his eyes, he quitted the room. He had barely had time to take half a dozen steps from the door, when the door opened again, and his savage but intelligent face made its appearance once more in the opening. "I came near forgetting," said he. "You are to have a brazier of charcoal ready." And he flung into his wife's apron the 5-franc piece which the philanthropist had left with him. A brazier of charcoal? Asked his wife. Yes. How many bushels? 2 good ones. That will come to 30 sous. With the rest I will buy something for dinner. The devil, no. Why? Don't go and spend the 100 sous piece. Why? Because I shall have to buy something too. What? Something. How much shall you need? Whereabouts in the neighborhood is there an ironmonger's shop? Rue Mouffetard. Ah, yes, at the corner of a street. I can see the shop. But tell me how much you will need for what you have to purchase. 50 sous, 3 francs. There won't be much left for dinner. Eating is not the point today. There's something better to be done. That's enough, my jewel. At this word from his wife, Jondrette closed the door again, and this time Marius heard his step die away in the corridor of the hovel and descend the staircase rapidly. At that moment, 1 o'clock struck from the church of Saint Médard. End of Book 8, Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 13. Solus cum solo, in loco remoto, non cogiebuntur orare pater noster. Marius, dreamer as he was, as we have said, firm and energetic by nature. His habits of solitary meditation, while they had developed in him sympathy and compassion, had perhaps diminished the faculty for irritation, but had left intact the power of waxing indignant. He had the kindliness of a Brahmin and the severity of a judge. He took pity upon a toad, but he crushed a viper. Now it was into a hole of vipers that his glance had just been directed. It was a nest of monsters that he had beneath his eyes. These wretches must be stamped upon, said he. Not one of the enigmas which he had hoped to see solved had been elucidated. On the contrary, all of them had been rendered more dense, if anything. He knew nothing more about the beautiful maiden of the Luxembourg and the man whom he called Monsieur Leblanc, except that Jondrette was acquainted with them. Athwart the mysterious words which had been uttered, the only thing of which he caught a distinct glimpse was the fact that an ambush was in course of preparation, a dark but terrible trap, that both of them were incurring great danger, she probably, her father certainly, that they must be saved, that the hideous plots of the Jondrettes must be thwarted, and the web of these spiders broken. He scanned the female Jondrette for a moment. She had pulled an old sheet-iron stove from a corner, and she was rummaging among the old heap of iron. He descended from the commode as softly as possible, taking care not to make the least noise. Amid his terror as to what was in preparation, and in the horror with which the Jondrettes had inspired him, he experienced a sort of joy at the idea that it might be granted to him, perhaps, to render a service to the one whom he loved. But how was it to be done? How warn the persons threatened? He did not know their address. They had reappeared for an instant before his eyes, and had then plunged back again into the immense depths of Paris. Should he wait for Monsieur Leblanc at the door that evening at 6 o'clock, at the moment of his arrival, and warn him of the trap? But Jondrette and his men would see him on the watch. The spot was lonely. They were stronger than he. They would devise means to seize him or get him away, and the man whom Marius was anxious to save would be lost. 1 o'clock had just struck. The trap was to be sprung at 6. Marius had 5 hours before him. There was but one thing to be done. He put on his decent coat, knotted a silk handkerchief round his neck, took his hat, and went out, without making any more noise than if he had been treading on moss with bare feet. Moreover, the Jondrette woman continued to rummage among her old iron. Once outside of the house, he made for the Rue du Petit Banquier. He had almost reached the middle of this street, near a very low wall which a man can easily step over at certain points, and which abuts on a waste space, and was walking slowly, in consequence of his preoccupied condition, and the snow deadened the sound of his steps. All at once he heard voices talking very close by. He turned his head. The street was deserted. There was not a soul in it. It was broad daylight, and yet he distinctly heard voices. It occurred to him to glance over the wall which he was skirting. There, in fact, sat two men, flat on the snow, with their backs against the wall, talking together in subdued tones. These two persons were strangers to him. One was a bearded man in a blouse, and the other a long-haired individual in rags. The bearded man had on a fez. The other's head was bare, and the snow had lodged in his hair. By thrusting his head over the wall, Marius could hear their remarks. The hairy one jogged the other man's elbow and said, "With the assistance of Patron Minette, it can't fail." "Do you think so?" said the bearded man, and the long-haired one began again. "It's as good as a warrant for each one of 500 balls, and the worst that can happen is 5 years, 6 years, 10 years at the most." The other replied with some hesitation, and shivering beneath his fez, "That's a real thing. You can't go against such things." "I tell you the affair can't go wrong," resumed the long-haired man. "Father What's-his-name's team will be already harnessed." Then they began to discuss a melodrama that they had seen on the preceding evening at the Gate Theatre. Marius went his way. It seemed to him that the mysterious words of these men, so strangely hidden behind that wall and crouching in the snow, could not but bear some relation to Jondrette's abominable projects. That must be the affair. He directed his course towards the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, and asked at the first shop he came to where he could find a commissary of police. He was directed to Rue de Pontoise, number 14. Thither Marius betook himself. As he passed a baker's shop, he bought a 2-penny roll and ate it, foreseeing that he should not dine. On the way, he rendered justice to Providence. He reflected that had he not given his 5 francs to the Jondrette girl in the morning, he would have followed Monsieur Leblanc's fiacre, and consequently have remained ignorant of everything, and that there would have been no obstacle to the trap of the Jondrettes, and that Monsieur Leblanc would have been lost, and his daughter with him, no doubt. End of Book 8, Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 14, in which a police agent bestows 2 fistfuls on a lawyer. On arriving at number 14, Rue de Pontoise, he ascended to the first floor and inquired for the commissary of police. "The commissary of police is not here," said a clerk, "but there is an inspector who takes his place. Would you like to speak to him? Are you in haste?" "Yes," said Marius. The clerk introduced him into the commissary's office. There stood a tall man behind a grating, leaning against the stove, and holding up with both hands the tails of a vast topcoat with 3 collars. His face was square, with a thin, firm mouth, thick, grey, and very ferocious whiskers, and a look that was enough to turn your pockets inside out. Of that glance it might have been well said, not that it penetrated, but that it searched. This man's air was not much less ferocious nor less terrible than Jondrette's. The dog is, at times, no less terrible to meet than the wolf. "What do you want?" he said to Marius, without adding monsieur. "Is this Monsieur le Commissaire de Police?" "He is absent. I am here in his stead." "The matter is very private." "Then speak." "And great haste is required." "Then speak quick." This calm, abrupt man was both terrifying and reassuring at one and the same time. He inspired fear and confidence. Marius related the adventure to him, that a person with whom he was not acquainted otherwise than by sight was to be inveigled into a trap that very evening, that, as he occupied the room adjoining the den, he, Marius Pontmercy, a lawyer, had heard the whole plot through the partition, that the wretch who had planned the trap was a certain Jondrette, that there would be accomplices, probably some prowlers of the barriers, among others a certain Pinchot, alias Printanier, alias Birenaille, that Jondrette's daughters were to lie in wait, that there was no way of warning the threatened man since he did not even know his name, and that, finally, all this was to be carried out at 6 o'clock that evening at the most deserted point of the Boulevard de l'Hôpital, in house number 50 to 52. At the sound of this number, the inspector raised his head and said coldly, "So it is in the room at the end of the corridor." "Precisely," answered Marius, and he added, "Are you acquainted with that house?" The inspector remained silent for a moment, then replied as he warmed the heel of his boot at the door of the stove, "Apparently." He went on, muttering between his teeth, and not addressing Marius so much as his cravat. Patron Minette must have had a hand in this. This word struck Marius. "Patron Minette," said he. "I did hear that word pronounced, in fact." And he repeated to the inspector the dialogue between the long-haired man and the bearded man in the snow behind the wall of the Rue de Petit Banquier. The inspector muttered, "The long-haired man must be Brujon, and the bearded one Nevillegoddard, alias de Milliard." He had dropped his eyelids again and became absorbed in thought. "As for Father What's-his-name, I think I recognize him. Here, I've burned my coat. They always have too much fire in these cursed stoves. Number 50 to 52, former property of Gorbeau." Then he glanced at Marius. "You saw only that bearded and that long-haired man? And Pinchot. You didn't see a little imp of a dandy prowling about the premises?" "No." "Nor a big lump of matter resembling an elephant in the Jardin des Plantes?" "No." "Nor a scamp with the air of an old red-tail?" "No." "As for the fourth, no one sees him, not even his adjutants, clerks and employees. It is not surprising that you did not see him." "No. Who are all those persons?" asked Marius. The inspector answered, "Besides, this is not the time for them." He relapsed into silence, then resumed. 50 to 52, I know that barrack. Impossible to conceal ourselves inside it without the artists seeing us, and then they will get off simply by countermanding the vaudeville. They are so modest, an audience embarrasses them. None of that, none of that. I want to hear them sing and make them dance." This monologue concluded, he turned to Marius and demanded, gazing at him intently the while, "Are you afraid?" "Of what?" said Marius. "Of these men." "No more than yourself," retorted Marius rudely, who had begun to notice that this police agent had not yet said "monsieur" to him. The inspector stared still more intently at Marius, and continued with sententious solemnity, "There, you speak like a brave man, and like an honest man. Courage does not fear crime, and honesty does not fear authority." Marius interrupted him. "That is well, but what do you intend to do?" The inspector contented himself with the remark, "The lodgers have pass-keys with which to get in at night. You must have one." "Yes," said Marius. "Have you it about you?" "Yes." "Give it to me," said the inspector. Marius took his key from his waistcoat pocket, handed it to the inspector, and added, "If you will take my advice, you will come in force." The inspector cast on Marius such a glance as Voltaire might have bestowed on a provincial academician who had suggested a rhyme to him. With one movement he plunged his hands, which were enormous, into the two immense pockets of his top-coat and pulled out two small steel pistols of the sort called knock-me-downs. Then he presented them to Marius, saying rapidly in a curt tone, "Take these. Go home. Hide in your chamber so that you may be supposed to have gone out. They are loaded. Each one carries 2 balls. You will keep watch. There is a hole in the wall, as you have informed me. These men will come. Leave them to their own devices for a time. When you think matters have reached a crisis, and that it is time to put a stop to them, fire a shot, not too soon. The rest concerns me. A shot into the ceiling, the air, no matter where. Above all things, not too soon. Wait until they begin to put their project into execution. You are a lawyer. You know the proper point." Marius took the pistols and put them in the side pocket of his coat. "That makes a lump that can be seen," said the inspector. "Put them in your trousers pocket." Marius hid the pistols in his trousers pockets. "Now," pursued the inspector, "there is not a minute more to be lost by anyone. What time is it? 2:30. 7 o'clock is the hour?" 6 o'clock, answered Marius. "I have plenty of time," said the inspector, "but no more than enough. Don't forget anything that I have said to you. Bang! A pistol shot." "Rest easy," said Marius. And as Marius laid his hand on the handle of the door on his way out, the inspector called to him, "By the way, if you have occasion for my services between now and then, come or send here. You will ask for Inspector Javert." End of Book 8, Chapter 14.